Hello everyone, I am Mr. Disturbing, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Before we dive into tonight's story, I want to ask you something. Have you ever felt like you were being watched in the woods? That prickly sensation on the back of your neck when you're alone in nature? Well, after you hear what happened to Marcus Thompson in the mountains of western North Carolina, you might think twice about that feeling. This is the story of the Appalachian shadow walker, and trust me, it's going to stay with you long after you finish reading. Marcus Thompson had always been drawn to the ancient mountains of western North Carolina. Growing up just outside Asheville, he'd spent countless hours exploring the rolling hills and deep hollows that made up some of the oldest mountain ranges on Earth. These peaks had stood for over 1 billion years, witnessing the rise and fall of countless species, holding secrets that predated even the earliest life forms that crawled from primordial seas. The mountains had their own energy, sometimes benevolent, sometimes neutral, and occasionally something far more sinister. Marcus had experienced the good side many times. He'd seen the mysterious brown mountain lights dancing across the horizon from Wiseman's View, those inexplicable orbs of light that scientists still couldn't fully explain. He'd felt the warm, comforting presence near the ruins of old mountain churches, where generations of faithful had once gathered to worship. These places radiated peace, like stepping into a perfect spring day where the sun warmed your face without burning. But this story isn't about those pleasant anomalies. This is about something that belonged to the darker side of Appalachian mysticism, something that had been lurking in these ancient hills long before humans ever set foot on the continent. In the fall of 2019, Marcus was attending night classes at AB Tech, studying automotive mechanics. His routine was simple and predictable: leave his part-time job at 2 p.m., attend classes until evening, then make the 30-minute drive home through the winding mountain roads. Usually he'd arrive home around 10:30 p.m., depending on traffic and weather conditions. Marcus drove the same route every night in his restored 1973 W200 Dodge pickup, a beast of a truck that had been in his family for decades. The old Dodge was reliable but loud, with a rumbling engine that announced its presence long before you could see it coming. On nights when the routine felt monotonous, Marcus would sometimes take the scenic route, jumping off I-40 to wind through the back roads that snaked between the mountains like ancient arteries. On this particular Thursday evening in October, Marcus had planned to stick to his usual route. He was exhausted from a long week of classes and work, and Friday was a rare day off. His plan was simple: get home early, get a good night's sleep, then wake up before dawn to hike into the mountains and watch the sunrise from one of his favorite overlooks. The night started normally enough. Marcus left campus right on schedule, the familiar rumble of the Dodge's engine providing a comforting soundtrack as he merged onto I-40. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of dying leaves and the promise of winter. He had his windows rolled down, enjoying the cool breeze that whispered through the cab of his truck. As he approached his exit, something began to feel different. The change was subtle at first, just a nagging sensation that something wasn't quite right. The night seemed to grow darker, as if the moon had suddenly disappeared behind thick clouds. The usual symphony of nocturnal sounds, crickets, owls, the distant call of a coyote, gradually faded to an unsettling silence. Marcus rolled up his windows, suddenly feeling confined in the cab of his truck. His breathing became shallow, and his heart began to beat just a little faster. He'd never experienced anxiety before, but something primitive in his brain was sending alarm signals he couldn't ignore. As he took the exit toward his parents' property, he noticed that the 24-hour truck stop that should have been blazing with lights was completely dark. The place never closed, never went dark. It was a landmark that truckers and locals relied on. Marcus tried to rationalize it away, telling himself the power was probably out, but the explanation felt hollow. He shifted through the gears slowly, trying to minimize the noise his truck made. Why he felt the need to be quiet, he couldn't say. It was an instinctive response to a threat he couldn't identify. He leaned forward, peering up through the windshield at the sky, expecting to see the familiar canopy of stars that was one of the benefits of living in a sparsely populated area. Instead, he saw almost nothing. The sky was nearly black, with only a few faint stars visible. In an area where the Milky Way was usually clearly visible on clear nights, this absence of celestial light was deeply unsettling. There were no clouds that Marcus could see, nothing to explain why the stars seemed to have vanished. As he navigated a sharp left curve, followed by a straight stretch of road, Marcus found himself looking at an old decaying barn that he'd admired countless times before. The structure was ancient, weathered by decades of mountain winters and summers, a testament to the generations of farmers who had worked this land. He often wondered about the history it had witnessed, the changes it had seen as the world modernized around it. In that moment of distraction, something large and pale burst from the darkness at the edge of the road. Marcus's first impression was of a massive, sickly-looking dog, but something about its movement was wrong. It was too large, too fluid, too purposeful. The creature ran directly into the path of his truck, no more than 10 feet in front of him. For what felt like an eternity, but could have been no more than 5 seconds, the creature stared directly at Marcus through the rearview mirror. It was as if those empty sockets could see directly into his soul, cataloging his fears and measuring his worth as prey. Marcus felt completely paralyzed, unable to move or think or breathe. The spell was broken when a light came on in a house beside the road. The creature immediately snapped its attention toward the light, then turned and loped into the woods on its hind legs, with a gait that was disturbingly human-like. The moment it disappeared into the darkness, Marcus jammed the truck into first gear and floored the accelerator, tires screaming as he raced toward home. When he arrived at his parents' house, both were already asleep. Marcus went straight to his basement bedroom and began loading every firearm he owned: rifles, shotguns, pistols, anything that could potentially stop whatever he had encountered. He checked and double-checked every door and window, ensuring they were all securely locked. The idea of waking his parents and trying to explain what had happened seemed impossible. Who would believe such a story? How could he possibly describe what he had seen in a way that would make sense to anyone else? So he remained silent, settling in for what he knew would be a sleepless night. The basement was unusually quiet that night. Even the family dogs, who normally barked at every sound from the surrounding woods, remained completely silent. The old post and beam house, which typically creaked and settled throughout the night, made no sound at all. It was as if the entire world was holding its breath. Around 3 a.m., just as Marcus was beginning to feel drowsy, the smell returned. It started faintly, barely noticeable, but gradually grew stronger until it filled the entire basement. The stench of death and decay was unmistakable, and Marcus knew with absolute certainty that his nightmare was not over. His father's home office was located in the basement, with large glass doors that faced the Pisgah National Forest, 500,000 acres of impenetrable wilderness that stretched for miles in every direction. Marcus had always found comfort in that view, but now it filled him with dread. Armed with his tactical 12-gauge and a powerful flashlight, Marcus finally worked up the courage to investigate. He covered the flashlight with his hand to avoid advertising his presence, then slowly made his way through the basement to his father's office. His heart was pounding so hard he was sure it could be heard throughout the house. As he turned the corner into the office, Marcus aimed the flashlight through the glass doors toward the tree line. There, standing motionless at the edge of the woods, was the creature. It stood perfectly still, those empty eye sockets fixed on the light, as if it could see directly through it to Marcus himself. Marcus quickly covered the flashlight and retreated to the living room, where he flipped on the powerful outdoor floodlights. When he looked back toward the woods, the creature was no longer at the tree line. Instead, it had moved closer to the house, standing in the open yard between the building and the forest, still perfectly motionless. Without hesitation, Marcus threw open the door and emptied every round from his shotgun in the creature's direction. The shots echoed through the mountains like thunder, and he was rewarded with an unearthly shriek that sounded like a woman being tortured. The creature bounded away into the darkness, moving with impossible speed and agility. The gunshots had awakened his parents, who came running downstairs demanding to know what was happening. Marcus told them he had scared away a bear that was getting into the trash, an explanation they accepted grudgingly. He could tell they didn't entirely believe him, but they also wouldn't have believed the truth. Marcus didn't sleep for the rest of that night, or for several nights afterward. He remained on high alert, waiting for the creature to return. But days passed without incident. Eventually, life seemed to return to normal, and Marcus began to convince himself that perhaps he had imagined the whole thing, that stress and exhaustion had caused some kind of hallucination. 6 years later, Marcus met Sarah, the woman who would become his wife. Her family lived in the same general area, just 4 or 5 miles up the road from his parents' house. Her mother's property sat at the mouth of a hollow, surrounded by the same ancient woods that had harbored his nightmare years earlier. Sarah's brother had once raised hunting dogs, and though he no longer kept them, the old kennels remained on the property. The concrete pads and chain-link fencing were still intact, making the space useful for quarantining animals when necessary. When Sarah's Great Pyrenees got into a fight with a raccoon, they had to isolate the dog for observation since his rabies vaccination had lapsed. The Great Pyrenees, a massive dog bred for guarding livestock, seemed to enjoy the solitude of the kennel. He was a gentle giant, content to wait patiently for his quarantine period to end. On the final night of his isolation, Marcus and Sarah walked up the trail to the kennel to bring him back to the house. As they made their way through the darkness using their phone flashlights, Marcus began to feel the same sensation he had experienced years earlier. The familiar dread crept up his spine, and his breathing became shallow. He didn't say anything to Sarah, not wanting to alarm her, but every instinct was telling him to run. Then the smell came drifting on the evening breeze, that unmistakable stench of rotting flesh that had haunted his dreams for years. Sarah noticed it immediately and jokingly asked if he had eaten something that disagreed with him. Marcus forced a laugh, but his blood had turned to ice water in his veins. Sarah grew up in these mountains, around hunters and outdoor enthusiasts. She immediately recognized that Marcus's demeanor had changed dramatically, and she asked what was wrong. He told her he would explain later. A response that she understood meant they were potentially in danger. As they approached the kennel, they could see the Great Pyrenees sitting patiently inside, his tail wagging as he spotted them approaching. But as they got closer, they heard something that made Marcus's blood run cold. The sound of a dog barking from inside the kennel, identical to the Great Pyrenees beside them. The barking was a perfect imitation, so exact that it was impossible to tell the difference between the real dog and whatever was mimicking it. The Great Pyrenees immediately went into guardian mode, sensing that something was seriously wrong. He began barking and growling in the direction of the sound, his hackles raised and his body tense. Marcus had never tried to drag a 150-pound dog before, but adrenaline gave him strength he didn't know he possessed. Even so, it was a monumental task. He was 6 feet tall and weighed 240 pounds, and it took everything he had to get the dog moving toward the house. The fake barking continued the entire time, seeming to grow closer and more insistent with each passing second. Sarah's mother heard the commotion and turned on the outdoor floodlights, just as they reached the safety of the fenced yard. In the brief moment of illumination, Marcus caught a glimpse of something large, stopping abruptly at the edge of the light, then wheeling around and disappearing back into the darkness. Once they were safely inside the house, Marcus told Sarah the entire story of his encounter 6 years earlier. She listened without interruption, her face growing pale as he described the creature in detail. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment before telling him about her family's history. Sarah came from a long line of what the locals called granny witches, women who practiced traditional Appalachian folk magic and healing. Her older sister Emma was particularly gifted in these arts, and she arrived the next morning with a collection of herbs and protective charms. Emma listened to Marcus's story with the same serious attention that Sarah had shown, nodding occasionally as if she recognized what he was describing. When he finished, she immediately began preparing a cleansing ritual for the property, burning specific herbs and reciting protective chants that had been passed down through generations of mountain families. Marcus suggested they also cleanse the area around the dog kennels, and Emma agreed. When they arrived at the kennel site, they found a scene of complete destruction. The concrete foundation was cracked and broken, the chain-link fencing had been torn from its posts, and the wooden dog houses had been reduced to splinters. The entire area reeked of the same rotting stench that had accompanied Marcus's encounters with the creature. Emma went about her work methodically, showing no surprise at the destruction. She blessed the area, burned her herbs, and led them back to the house. Once inside, she turned to Marcus and Sarah with a stern expression and gave them a warning that chilled Marcus to the bone. Stay out of the woods after dark until this thing moves on or finds what it's looking for. 2 years later, Sarah joined the military and was stationed in Delaware. Marcus, who had spent his entire life surrounded by the mountains and endless wilderness of Appalachia, found Delaware to be a stark contrast. The state felt lifeless compared to the vibrant energy of the mountains, and the populated areas seemed to lack the spiritual connection to the land that he had always taken for granted. They eventually found a house in a quiet rural community in southern Delaware, far from the crowds and noise of the cities. While the land lacked the ancient energy of Appalachian soil, it was peaceful and safe. Marcus began to relax for the first time in years, allowing himself to spend time outdoors after dark without the constant fear that had plagued him in North Carolina. Their new property had a large yard that bordered a small patch of woods, and Marcus enjoyed building fires in his fire pit and spending evenings outside with Sarah's dogs. For months, everything was perfect. He began to believe that whatever had been stalking him in the mountains had been left behind, unable to follow him hundreds of miles away from its ancient hunting grounds. On a cool evening in late fall, Marcus was outside with the dogs, tending a fire and enjoying some homemade moonshine from a mason jar. A taste of home that reminded him of the mountains he both loved and feared. As the fire began to die down, their American bulldog suddenly bolted toward the woods with the intensity of a dog who had spotted something significant. The dog, weighing about 110 pounds, was strong and determined. Marcus's first instinct was to tackle him before he could disappear into the woods and get lost. As he brought the dog down and hoisted him over his shoulders in a fireman's carry, he heard something that made his blood freeze, the sound of a dog barking. The barking was identical to his American bulldog's voice, but it wasn't coming from the dog on his shoulders. Instead, the real dog was producing a deep, threatening growl that Marcus had never heard before. The fake barking continued, seeming to come from multiple directions at once, creating an eerie chorus that surrounded them. As Marcus ran toward the house with the dog over his shoulders, the familiar stench of death and decay began to fill the air. The other dogs met him at the back door, their behavior indicating that they too sensed something was terribly wrong. Marcus threw open the door, rushed inside, and immediately began loading his firearms. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Somehow the creature had followed him 650 miles from the mountains of North Carolina to the rural suburbs of Delaware. The distance should have been impossible for any normal predator to track, but Marcus was beginning to understand that nothing about this situation was normal. He turned on the floodlights and looked out toward the tree line. Several bushes and small trees at the edge of the woods were still swaying, as if something large had just passed through them. His dog spent the entire night barking and howling, trying to get to the windows, desperate to confront whatever was lurking in the darkness outside. Marcus didn't sleep that night, and he knew he wouldn't be sleeping well for a long time to come. The creature had somehow tracked him across hundreds of miles, through multiple states, to a place where it should have had no connection or ability to follow. The implications were terrifying. If it could follow him to Delaware, it could follow him anywhere. As dawn broke over his new home, Marcus made a decision that he knew would govern the rest of his life. He would never again set foot in the woods after dark, no matter where he lived or how safe he felt. The creature had proven that distance meant nothing to it, that it could appear anywhere at any time. The ancient mountains of Appalachia had birthed something that defied explanation, something that existed outside the normal rules of nature and geography. It had chosen Marcus for reasons he couldn't understand, and it had demonstrated a persistence and ability that suggested it would never give up the hunt. Somewhere in the darkness, whether in the mountains of North Carolina or the woods of Delaware, the creature was still out there, still watching, still waiting. And Marcus knew that no matter how far he ran or how carefully he planned his life, the shadow walker would always be just beyond the reach of the light. Patient and relentless in its pursuit, the mountains had marked him, claimed him as their own, and sent their darkest guardian to ensure that he would never truly escape their ancient, terrible embrace. In the end, Marcus realized, you can leave Appalachia, but Appalachia never truly leaves you. And sometimes what follows you out of those ancient hills is far worse than anything you left behind. Let me ask you something. Have you ever felt like you were being watched by something that wasn't quite human? Something that understood the ancient rules of a place you'd never been before? What I'm about to share with you is a story that will make you question everything you think you know about the deep woods of Appalachia. This is the story of what happened to two friends who stumbled into something older and more terrifying than they could have ever imagined. This is the story of the Appalachian hunters. Leon had always been the planner. When she suggested the October road trip through the Appalachian Mountains to her best friend Charlie, she had mapped out every scenic overlook, every quaint mountain town, every Instagram-worthy photo opportunity. What she hadn't planned for was the ancient darkness that dwelt in the spaces between the maps. The first 3 days had been perfect. They'd driven through Virginia's Blue Ridge Mountains, stopped at roadside craft shops, and slept in cozy bed and breakfasts with names like Mountain Laurel Inn and Misty Hollow Lodge. The autumn leaves painted the mountainsides in brilliant oranges and reds, and their social media feeds filled with envy-inducing photos of mountain vistas and small-town charm. But on the fourth day, something changed. They'd taken a wrong turn somewhere near the Tennessee border, following what their GPS insisted was a legitimate highway, but looked more like a forgotten logging road. The asphalt had given way to gravel, then to dirt, and still the device cheerfully announced they were on the fastest route to their destination. The trees grew closer to the road here, their branches forming a canopy so thick that even the midday sun struggled to penetrate. Ancient oaks and maples towered overhead, their trunks scarred by decades of storms and marked with strange symbols that neither woman recognized. The air itself felt different, thicker, heavier, as if the mountains were holding their breath. Charlie gripped the steering wheel tighter as they navigated another hairpin turn. The silence in the car had grown uncomfortable, broken only by the crunch of gravel beneath their tires and the occasional ping of their phones losing signal. Even the radio had died, leaving them with nothing but static and the sound of their own breathing. The smell hit them first, a sweet cloying odor that seeped through the car's ventilation system despite the windows being up. It was the smell of decay, of things left too long in the damp earth, mixed with something else, something that made their stomachs turn and their skin crawl. Leanne noticed it in the rearview mirror first. A pickup truck, rust-colored and ancient, following them at a distance. It appeared around the same bend where they'd first smelled the decay, as if it had materialized from the forest itself. The driver was just a silhouette, but something about the way the truck moved, slow, deliberate, patient, made her skin prickle with unease. The gas station appeared like a mirage in the wilderness, its single pump standing sentinel beside a weathered building that looked like it had been there since the mountains first rose from the earth. Hand-painted signs advertised cold drinks and bait, but the windows were too dark to see inside and no other cars sat in the small gravel lot. Charlie pulled up to the pump, her hands trembling slightly as she turned off the engine. The sudden silence was deafening. No birds sang, no insects buzzed. Even the wind seemed to have died, leaving the mountain air still and oppressive. The pump was old, the kind that required you to go inside to pay first. Leon volunteered, needing to escape the claustrophobic feeling that had settled over her like a shroud. The screen door creaked open on rusted hinges, revealing an interior that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Behind the counter sat a man who might have been 50 or might have been 70, his weathered face impossible to read in the dim light. His eyes were the color of winter sky, pale and cold, and they fixed on Leon with an intensity that made her step back instinctively. The walls were covered with hunting photos, deer, bear, wild boar, but as her eyes adjusted, she realized something was wrong with them. The animal's eyes had been scratched out in every single photograph, leaving dark, empty sockets that seemed to watch her move through the store. Behind the man hung a different kind of photograph. A group of people in the woods, but their faces were obscured by masks made of animal skulls and twisted branches. They stood in a circle around something dark and shapeless on the ground, their hands raised toward a moonless sky. The man's voice, when he finally spoke, was like gravel grinding against stone. He quoted her a price for the gas, exact change, no credit cards, and his fingers lingered on hers when she handed him the crumpled bills from her pocket. His skin felt like bark, rough and cold, and she jerked her hand away as if burned. Outside, she could see Charlie pumping gas, her movements quick and nervous. The rust-colored pickup truck had appeared in the lot, though she hadn't heard it arrive. 3 figures sat inside, their faces hidden by the shadows of wide-brimmed hats. They weren't moving, weren't talking, just watching. The man behind the counter smiled, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too white. He gestured toward the window with one gnarled finger, and Leon realized with growing horror that there were more trucks now. They'd appeared silently, like predators emerging from the forest, and each one contained shadowy figures who sat perfectly still, perfectly patient. The first sign of real trouble came 10 miles down the mountain road. The trucks had been following them since they left the gas station, maintaining a careful distance but never falling completely out of sight. Their headlights flickered through the trees like the eyes of nocturnal hunters, always there in the peripheral vision, always watching. Charlie tried to lose them by taking a series of random turns, but the mountain roads all seemed to lead back to the same places, the same twisted oak tree, the same rock formation that looked like a sleeping giant, the same creek that ran black with runoff from some unseen source. The trucks were hurting them, Leon realized. Each time they tried to turn toward what might be civilization, one of the vehicles would appear ahead of them, blocking their path with its bulk. Each time they tried to stop, another would materialize behind them, its engine rumbling with patient menace. Night fell faster in the mountains than it should have, as if the darkness were rising from the earth itself, rather than descending from the sky. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in as many minutes, and their breath began to fog the windshield despite the car's heater running at full blast. That's when they saw the first of the scarecrows. It stood in a clearing beside the road, arms outstretched in a grotesque parody of welcome. But this wasn't made of straw and old clothes. This was made of bones, animal bones, human bones, bones that had been bleached white by mountain winters and held together with sinew and wire. Its skull was crowned with antlers, and its eye sockets held burning coals that glowed red in the darkness. More appeared as they drove deeper into the mountains. Dozens of them, standing in perfect formation like an army of the dead. Each one was unique, some small and hunched, others tall and imposing, but all shared the same burning eyes, the same sense of malevolent intelligence. The trucks behind them had multiplied. What had started as 3 or 4 vehicles had become a convoy of shadows, their headlights creating a constellation of predatory stars in the rearview mirror. They moved in perfect synchronization, like a pack of wolves that had learned to drive. Charlie's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, her breathing shallow and rapid. She kept glancing at the fuel gauge, watching the needle drop toward empty with each passing mile. They were running out of gas, out of road, out of options. The road ended at a clearing that shouldn't have existed. One moment they were driving through dense forest, the next they were surrounded by open space beneath a canopy of stars that seemed too bright, too numerous, too close. The trucks had formed a perfect circle around them, their headlights pointed inward like the spokes of a wheel. In the center of the clearing stood a structure that defied description. It was part temple, part slaughterhouse, built from the bones of countless animals arranged in spiraling patterns that hurt to look at directly. Antlers formed archways, rib cages created windows, and at the very top, a human skull crowned with a wreath of mountain laurel gazed down with empty sockets. The truck engines died in unison, leaving only the sound of wind through the trees and the distant call of something that might have been an owl, but sounded too much like laughter. Car doors opened and closed with mechanical precision, and figures emerged from the shadows. They were human, but just barely. Their faces were painted with mud and ash, their bodies draped in animal skins that still reeked of death. They moved with the fluid grace of predators, their eyes reflecting the starlight like mirrors. Some carried tools, knives, axes, things with curved blades that gleamed silver in the darkness. Others carried symbols carved from bone and wood, twisted shapes that seemed to writhe and shift when viewed directly. The leader stepped forward, and Leon's breath caught in her throat. It was the man from the gas station, but transformed. His face was striped with white paint, his hair woven with feathers and small bones. Around his neck hung a necklace of teeth. Human teeth, she realized with sick certainty. He raised his arms to the sky and spoke, but not in any language she recognized. The words were guttural, primal, older than civilization. They seemed to come from the earth itself, vibrating through the soles of her feet and into her bones. The others began to move, forming their own circle around the bone structure. They walked in a pattern that made no sense but felt somehow inevitable, their footsteps creating a rhythm that matched the frantic beating of her heart. Some began to chant, their voices rising and falling like wind through a canyon. The ritual began at midnight, when the veil between worlds grew thin and ancient hungers stirred in the deep places of the earth. The cultists, for that's what they were, Leon realized, though cult seemed too modern a word for something this old, moved with practiced precision around the bone cathedral. They had built this place over generations, she understood now. Each hunting season brought new offerings, new bones to add to the structure. The scarecrows weren't decorations. They were monuments to successful hunts, each one representing a life taken in service to something vast and hungry that dwelt in the mountain's heart. The man from the gas station pulled out a blade carved from a single piece of obsidian, its edges sharp enough to cut moonlight. He began to carve symbols into the earth, each cut releasing a smell like copper and ozone. The symbols glowed faintly in the darkness, as if lit from within by some unholy fire. Charlie grabbed Leon's hand, her fingers ice cold despite the warmth of the car's interior. They both knew, without speaking, that they were meant to be the centerpiece of whatever was about to happen. The final ingredients in a recipe that had been cooking for centuries. The chanting grew louder, more insistent. Other voices joined in, voices that seemed to come from the forest itself, from the rocks and streams and ancient trees. The mountain was singing, Leon realized, and the song was about hunger and sacrifice and the price of trespassing in sacred spaces. The bone structure began to glow, each piece emanating a soft, phosphorescent light that grew brighter with each passing moment. The skull at the top turned, impossible though it was, and fixed its empty gaze on their car. When it opened its mouth, the sound that emerged was the collective death rattle of every animal that had ever died in these mountains. The car started on the third try, its engine coughing to life just as the first of the cultists began moving toward them. Charlie threw it into reverse, not caring about the truck behind them, not caring about anything except getting away from the bone cathedral and its unholy congregation. The impact sent them spinning, metal screaming against metal as they careened off the other vehicle. But the truck didn't pursue. Its driver sat motionless behind the wheel, his head tilted at an angle that suggested his neck was broken. Had been broken, Leon realized, for a very long time. They found a gap in the circle of trucks, a space just wide enough for their car to squeeze through. Charlie floored the accelerator and they plunged back into the forest, branches scraping against the windows like skeletal fingers trying to drag them back. Behind them, the chanting reached a crescendo that shook the very ground. The bone structure erupted in light, a pillar of phosphorescence that stretched toward the star-drunk sky. For a moment, something vast and formless seemed to take shape in the glow. Something with too many eyes and too many teeth. Something that had been waiting in the dark spaces between the atoms for its moment to feed. They drove without headlights, guided only by starlight and desperation. The forest seemed to fight them, roads appearing and disappearing like mirages, familiar landmarks shifting and changing when they weren't looking directly at them. The mountain itself had become a living thing, a trap designed to hold them until the hunters could finish their ancient work. But eventually, impossibly, they found pavement, real pavement, with yellow lines and reflectors and all the mundane markers of civilization. The truck stop that materialized out of the darkness was blazing with fluorescent light, its parking lot full of 18-wheelers and ordinary cars driven by ordinary people who had never seen a bone cathedral or heard the mountain's hungry song. They drove straight through to Atlanta, taking turns at the wheel, never speaking about what they'd seen in the clearing. The radio worked again, playing pop songs and traffic reports and advertisements for things that belonged to the daylight world. Their phones had signal, their GPS showed recognizable roads, and the gas gauge behaved like a normal mechanical device rather than a countdown to doom. But the smell lingered. No matter how many times they washed their clothes, how many showers they took, how many candles they burned, the sweet stench of decay clung to them like a second skin. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but it was always there, a reminder of the place they'd been and the things they'd witnessed. Charlie quit her job 2 weeks later and moved to Phoenix, as far from the mountains as she could get. She sent Leon a postcard once, a picture of a desert sunset with 2 words on the back: "Still smells." Leon stayed in Atlanta, but she found herself drawn to maps of Appalachia, spending hours tracing the mountain roads with her finger and wondering about the communities that existed in the spaces between the highways. She read about missing hikers, about cars found abandoned on remote mountain roads, about local legends of things that hunted in the deep woods. The stories were always the same, she realized. People who went into the mountains and never came out. People who came out changed, speaking in whispers about things they couldn't quite remember. People who disappeared entirely, leaving behind only their belongings and the lingering smell of something that had been dead for a very long time. She started having dreams about the bone cathedral. In them, she could see new additions to the structure: fresh bones, still bloody, still warm. She could hear the chanting growing louder and more insistent with each passing night, and she could feel something watching her, something patient and hungry that knew exactly where she lived. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by a postal service that had no record of who had sent it. The envelope was made of paper that felt like skin, and it smelled of mountain air and old death. Inside was a single photograph: the Bone Cathedral, but larger now, more elaborate, with new additions that gleamed white in the starlight. At the base of the structure, arranged in perfect formation, were 2 new scarecrows. They were smaller than the others, more delicate, made from bones that looked almost human. One wore the remnants of a college sweatshirt, the other a pair of hiking boots that looked disturbingly familiar. On the back of the photograph, written in what might have been blood, was a single line: "The hunt never ends." Leon burned the photograph, but it wouldn't catch fire. She tried to tear it, but the paper was stronger than it looked. She tried to throw it away, but it always found its way back to her mailbox, her desk, her bedside table. It was waiting for her no matter where she went, a reminder that some things couldn't be escaped, couldn't be forgotten, couldn't be undone. The dreams grew more frequent, more vivid. She could see the cultists in their animal skins, could hear their ancient chanting, could smell the sweet stench of their sacrificial offerings. And in the center of it all, the Bone Cathedral grew larger and more elaborate, fed by an endless stream of travelers who had made the mistake of straying from the beaten path. She stopped driving through mountains, stopped taking road trips, stopped going anywhere that might lead her back to those dark places between the maps. But it didn't matter. The mountain had marked her, claimed her, and distance was just another illusion in the face of something that had been hunting in these hills since before humans learned to make fire. The last entry in her journal, found by police after her disappearance, consisted of a single line repeated over and over until it filled the entire page: "They're coming for me. They're coming for me. They're coming for me." Her car was found 3 days later on a remote mountain road in Tennessee, its doors open, its engine still running. The GPS showed no record of how it had gotten there, and the security cameras at the last gas station she'd visited showed her driving alone, heading east toward the mountains she'd sworn never to visit again. The search lasted 2 weeks, but the mountain kept its secrets. The search dogs lost her scent at the edge of a clearing where someone had once built something from bones, and the helicopters found nothing but endless forest stretching toward horizons that seemed to shift and change depending on the angle of observation. But sometimes, on clear nights when the moon is dark and the wind carries the scent of decay, hikers report seeing lights in the deep woods. They speak of structures that shouldn't exist, of chanting that seems to come from the earth itself, and of scarecrows that watch from the shadows with eyes that burn like coals. And sometimes, if you know where to look and you're brave enough to stray from the marked trails, you can still find the Bone Cathedral. It's larger now, more elaborate, decorated with fresh offerings that gleam white in the starlight. At its base stand countless scarecrows, each one a monument to the mountain's endless hunger. Among them, 2 figures stand watch with empty sockets where their eyes should be, their bones bleached white by mountain winters, their skulls crowned with wreaths of mountain laurel. They were travelers once, adventurers who thought they could pass through the ancient places without paying the price. Now they are part of the hunt, part of the mountain's dark song, part of something older and hungrier than civilization itself. They stand sentinel in the clearing, waiting for the next car to take a wrong turn, the next hikers to stray from the path, the next offering to feed the bone cathedral's endless appetite. Listen close, young ones, while these old bones still remember. This happened back in '87 when your daddy Peter was just 26 and working at the auto shop down in town. He was dating that sweet girl Siren from the next valley over, and my nephew Max was living in one of them converted apartments in the old Victorian house. The mountains were different then, older, quieter. They held secrets that folks nowadays don't want to believe in. It started on an October night when Peter was driving home to the family cabin. I was visiting your aunt in Asheville, left him alone on the property. He said later that something felt wrong the moment he hit them back roads. The radio went to static, the night sounds died away, and an awful silence pressed down like a heavy blanket. Near old Morrison's barn, he saw something cross the road, 8 feet tall at the shoulder, moving with a grace that ain't natural in these parts. Not elk, not bear, something else entirely. The stench hit him next, rolling through his truck window like the breath of death itself. Then came the howling. Started human-like, then dropped into something that had no business coming from any throat in God's creation. More joined in from different directions, and Peter realized he was surrounded. He gunned that old Ford up the mountain, shapes keeping pace in the trees. Made it to the cabin, locked himself in with his hunting rifle. Sat in my recliner all night, watching the windows. Around 2 in the morning, it came for him. Started with scratching at the back wall, slow and deliberate, like it was savoring his fear. Moved along the cabin wall until it stopped right outside the picture window. That's when he saw the eyes. 2 points of yellow fire, 8 feet off the ground, burning with an intelligence that wasn't of this world. They stared at him through the glass for what felt like hours. Never blinking, never moving. Just watching and learning. Come dawn, they were gone, but the footprints remained. Massive, clawed impressions in the soft earth beneath the window. Too big for human, too purposeful for animal. Peter got a text from Siren saying strange things were happening at her place. Found her chicken coop destroyed, birds taken clean away. Same tracks circling her property, but these were different somehow. More defined. Like the thing was getting better at what it did. They packed up and headed for town, but the deputies had roadblocks up. Some kind of animal attack, they said. Ha! If only they knew what they were dealing with. Made it to Max's place in town. Spent the morning looking through my old books and my great-grandfather's journal. Found stories about shadow walkers and forest demons. Ancient guardians that protected the mountains from intruders. But no solutions. These things were described as forces of nature, unstoppable as landslides or floods. The creature followed them to town. Chaos in the streets. People running and screaming while a shadow flowed between them like liquid darkness. They tried to escape in Max's car, but it was waiting at the town limits. 10 feet tall up close, with limbs too long for its body and skin that rippled like oil on water. Face was a void except for those burning yellow eyes. It struck the car with one massive hand, sent them rolling down an embankment. They made it to a cave system in the rocks, thought they'd found safety. But the thing tracked them there too. Claws scraping on stone, taking its time, savoring their terror. When it finally appeared, blocking their only escape, it spoke. Voice like grinding stone, older than the mountains themselves, said it had walked these peaks since before humans learned to make fire, watched civilization spread like a disease, poisoning streams and clear-cutting forests. It meant to cleanse the mountains, remove human presence forever. They were to be the last. But then she appeared, the old woman, the keeper of the old ways, native blood, guardian of the balance. Her golden light pushed back the shadows, forced the creature to retreat. She led them out through passages that hadn't existed before, drove them to the state line in her ancient truck. Told them never to return. The old places still held the old powers, and the balance had been disturbed. Your daddy Peter married Siren, moved to the city with Max. Made new lives far from these mountains. They never spoke of what happened, but they never forgot. Sometimes at night they'd dream of those yellow eyes watching from the darkness. The mountains remember everything, children, and some things are better left undisturbed. That creature is still out there, still hunting, still protecting the old ways from the new world. So when you're older and the mountains call to you, remember this tale. Show respect or face the consequences. The ancient peaks of Appalachia have long memories, and the hunter never sleeps.